Silas Moore had never asked for a fight with anyone, and in fact most of his neighbors barely remembered the last time they had heard him speak, let alone take part in a neighborhood dispute. He was the kind of man who gave no reason for gossip. He paid his property taxes on time, he kept to himself, he did not attend parties, and he never showed up at the endless meetings that the local homeowners association seemed to treat as both a civic duty and a social performance. His house was not new nor impressive, a low wooden structure that still carried the bones of the 1970s, with shingles that had dulled to a flat brown and a porch where the boards had warped slightly under decades of heat and rain. To outsiders it might have looked neglected, but Silas lived there with a quiet order that only he understood. He had inherited the place from his father, who had built it long before the neighborhood became fashionable, and long before an ambitious group of residents formed an HOA to decide what belonged and what did not. Silas was not technically a member because his father had signed the property deed in a way that excluded their lot from the founding charter. But that small legal quirk had always irritated the board. They could not fine him for the color of his shutters, they could not demand that he replace his mailbox to match the approved style, and they could not order him to mow his lawn to the regulation length. For years they had tolerated him like one tolerates an immovable stone in the path, muttering complaints but knowing nothing could be done. That uneasy balance held until the HOA decided to expand its clubhouse, a once modest building that had been steadily transformed into something more like a country club, complete with a catering hall, a new pool, and plans for a rooftop terrace. To make it work, they needed space, and the only space that stood in their way was Silas's narrow strip of land. It began innocuously enough. One evening, as Silas sat on the porch with his coffee cooling in his hand, he noticed new signs posted along the road. Future site of community improvement. He did not think much of it, assuming it was another vanity project. But a week later, he returned from the grocery store to find surveyor flags planted on the edges of his property, bright orange stakes pushed into the ground as if someone had already claimed them. He pulled one out, examined the marker with its coded numbers, and then tossed it aside without a word. When a neighbor passing by asked him what he thought of the new project, Silas only shrugged, giving the same unreadable look he always gave, the one that made people uneasy because it revealed nothing. The HOA board president, Joanna Lynn, a sharp woman who carried herself like a corporate executive, made the first direct move. She appeared at his porch one afternoon in heels far too fine for the uneven gravel driveway and introduced herself as if they were strangers, though she had lived 3 doors down for a decade. She spoke at length about how the community was growing, how everyone deserved better amenities, how this expansion would raise property values for all, and how it would be simpler if he agreed to a land exchange that had already been conceptually approved. Silas listened, leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded, and when she finished her polished speech he simply turned, went inside, and closed the door without saying a word. The rejection was not loud, but it was absolute, and for Joanna it was unforgivable. From that moment, the board treated him as an obstacle to be removed, not a neighbor to be respected. They began sending letters addressed not to him, but to occupant, declaring that his lot was under review for compliance, as if he were already guilty of some infraction. They requested access for temporary measurements and soil evaluations. He ignored them all, and each unanswered letter only seemed to embolden them. The neighbors whispered about him, not out of malice, but because the silence around his intentions made them nervous. They wondered if he would fight, or sell, or simply vanish one day. But Silas did nothing at all, and that inaction paradoxically began to feel like resistance more powerful than any open protest. The tension grew as the construction schedule drew nearer. Trucks began delivering materials to the clubhouse, and the crews worked late into the night with floodlights that bled into his windows. Still, he made no complaint. He sat on the porch, night after night, watching, as if the whole spectacle were a play staged for his private amusement, By the time the HOA board finally voted to authorize intervention, most of the residents barely understood what that meant, and those who did were too afraid of Joanna's authority to object. 10 men were chosen, not all professionals, some volunteers from the community itself, and they were told that their task was nothing more than preparation. But everyone who knew the truth understood that the preparation meant taking control of Silas Moore's land. Word spread in fragments, whispered at mailboxes and driveways until it carried an air of inevitability. Something was going to happen to Silas. Something the board believed he would not resist. And Silas himself, sitting motionless on that old porch with his coffee, seemed to be waiting for it, as if he knew before anyone else that the day was coming when silence would no longer be enough. The first official blow fell not with noise, but with paper. One gray morning, when the clouds hung low enough to make the air feel heavy, Silas found an envelope tucked into the slats of his porch railing. It bore no return address, only a stamped seal that read, "Community Compliance." He carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table without opening it, and went about his routine. Hours later, when the kettle had cooled and the afternoon shadows stretched long across the room, he finally tore the flap and slid out the letter. The words were written in the kind of bureaucratic jargon designed to sound neutral but carrying the unmistakable tone of command. According to the notice, his property had been provisionally reclassified as communal buffer land, pending physical reclamation. It demanded that he vacate the lot within 30 days to facilitate community improvements. There was no signature at the bottom, only a typed line that said, "On behalf of the board." Silas read it once, then again, then folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He did not shout, he did not curse, and he did not rush to the phone. He placed the envelope in the drawer where he kept old utility receipts and grocery store coupons and returned to his porch, where the wind stirred faintly through the trees. His silence, as always, was his answer. But silence is never neutral in a community obsessed with control. Silence is defiance. Within days, the board escalated. A group of 3 men arrived wearing reflective vests as though they were municipal workers. They hammered wooden stakes into his yard and tied bright yellow tape between them, cordoning off a rectangle that cut directly across his driveway. When Silas stepped outside and stood watching, one of them muttered that they were preparing ground access for authorized equipment. He said it with the rehearsed certainty of someone who had been told what to say and instructed not to answer questions. Silas did not approach them, nor did he ask them to leave. He simply watched until they grew uncomfortable under his gaze and finished their task in hurried silence. That night the tape snapped in the wind, flapping like a row of tattered flags, and by morning it lay scattered across the gravel. Silas did not remove it, nor repair it, and when the workers returned they looked at the mess, muttered to each other, and replaced the stakes with thicker ones. Again, he did nothing. The board's patience began to fray. Joanna Lynn herself returned, this time not in heels but in practical boots, striding across the lawn as if she already owned it. She carried a clipboard and spoke as if she were addressing an employee who had failed to read a memo. "Mr. Moore," she began, though she knew perfectly well that he would not answer. "You are currently residing on land that has been reassigned under Article 12 of our Charter. For the benefit of the entire community, you will need to comply with relocation. We have arranged temporary housing for you during the transition period." She gestured vaguely toward the row of townhomes at the edge of the neighborhood. "It is more modern than this structure, and I'm sure you'll find it convenient." Silas leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, eyes following her gestures but giving no reply. She spoke for several minutes, detailing timelines, referencing charts and schedules, quoting rules and bylaws as if the sheer density of words would eventually force his compliance. When at last she finished and looked at him expectantly, he shifted his weight, turned, and walked inside, closing the door with the same quiet finality as before. For Joanna, that door closing was the true catalyst. She went back to the board meeting that evening, her voice sharp, her confidence unshaken, and declared that Moore had chosen to resist. The minutes recorded her words with bureaucratic neatness. Resolved, that physical reclamation of Lot 14 proceed under the authority of the board, with due force as necessary. 10 members signed their agreement, not all of them with conviction, but none willing to be the dissenting voice. And so it was that a week later, on a brisk morning when most of the neighborhood was at work or school, 10 men gathered at the edge of Silas's lot. Some were contractors paid under the table, others were simply residents drafted into service with promises of reduced fees or favors from the board. They carried crowbars, sledgehammers, and bolt cutters, their expressions a mixture of reluctance and bravado. At their head stood Joanna, directing them like an officer leading a unit. The plan, if one could call it that, was simple. Dismantle the structures on Moore's property, clear the debris, and mark the ground for annexation. If Moore protested, they would escort him to the waiting truck parked discreetly around the corner. Silas watched from the porch as the men spread out across the yard. One knelt to cut the padlock on the shed, another began measuring the side of the house with a tape reel, as if they were preparing a demolition survey. A third man, perhaps emboldened by the lack of response, strode directly up the porch steps and announced, "Sir, this area is being reclaimed for community use. We're authorized to proceed." He held a sheet of paper aloft, but the words meant nothing. It was not a court order, not a deed transfer, just a typed memo on letterhead. Silas did not take it. He simply looked at the man, then at the paper, then let his gaze drift back to the yard where the others were moving. The man faltered, his voice dropping, but Joanna called sharply from below, "Continue. Do not engage further." The sound of tools striking wood and metal filled the air, mingling with the caw of distant crows. Boards splintered, hinges screeched, nails were pried loose. Silas remained motionless, his face unreadable, as if he were a spectator at an event staged for someone else's amusement. To anyone watching, it might have looked like submission, but to the men laboring in his yard, it was more unnerving than resistance. They expected shouting, threats, perhaps even physical struggle. Instead, they were confronted with the weight of his silence, and under that weight their own actions began to feel like trespass, even theft. By mid-afternoon the shed roof had been torn away, leaving a skeleton of beams jutting awkwardly into the sky. One of the men cursed when a board split unexpectedly, driving a nail into his palm. Blood spotted the ground, and the others exchanged uneasy glances. Joanna barked orders to keep working, insisting that progress must be visible. Yet the more they worked, the more unstable the ground seemed to feel beneath their feet, as though the land itself resisted. Vibrations carried into the soil, echoing toward the nearby clubhouse where construction materials had been stacked in precarious piles. It was at this moment that a low groan, more felt than heard, rolled from the direction of the clubhouse. Heads turned, hands froze, and silence stretched before the sound of cracking wood and shifting stone broke it. One of the men dropped his tool and ran toward the noise, shouting, but before he reached the site, part of the clubhouse wall buckled inward, spilling plaster and dust into the air. The collapse was not total, not yet, but it was enough to send panic rippling through the crew. They argued in hurried voices, some wanting to stop, others urging to finish quickly before anyone noticed. Joanna shouted above them all that it was a minor structural issue, and that the reclamation must proceed as planned. Silas remained on his porch, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the chaos unfolding before him. He did not speak, did not lift a hand, yet his presence hung over the scene like a judgment no one had invited but no one could ignore. The men, sweating and anxious, returned to their work, but none of them could shake the feeling that they had crossed into something irreversible. What began as paperwork had now become a spectacle of splintering beams and crumbling walls, and though the board called it progress, Everyone involved felt the creeping dread that they had unleashed something they no longer controlled. The collapse of the clubhouse wall was dismissed publicly as an unfortunate construction mishap. Yet behind the closed doors of the boardroom, the atmosphere was brittle with unease. Joanna Lynn called an emergency session, her clipped voice demanding silence as she spread photographs of the damage across the table. She insisted that the problem had originated not with their plans, but with Silas Moore's obstinate refusal to cooperate, arguing that his property's outdated structures and the unstable soil beneath them had created vibrations that undermined the new foundations. It was a theory so absurd that even the more compliant board members shifted in their seats, but none of them dared to openly contradict her. Instead, they voted, 10 hands rising with varying degrees of reluctance to intensify their actions against Silas. If a wall had fallen, then the solution was not to stop, but to push harder, faster, and ensure that his land was absorbed into the project before anyone from outside the neighborhood could intervene. The following morning, Silas awoke to the thud of hammers not on his property but around it. The board had authorized the installation of a temporary perimeter fence, and by the time the sun was fully above the trees, metal posts had been driven deep into the soil surrounding his yard. Workers stretched chain-link panels across them, sectioning off his house as if it were an abandoned site slated for demolition. Bright plastic signs were zip-tied to the fencing. Restricted access. Community Improvement Zone. The irony of declaring his home a zone for improvement while it still stood, inhabited, was lost on no one, yet no one came to his defense. Neighbors walked by quickly, eyes averted, unwilling to acknowledge what they were witnessing. Silas did not emerge at once, but by afternoon he appeared on his porch, carrying an old chair that he set down just inside the fence line. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, his gaze steady and unflinching, watching as men hauled more equipment to the clubhouse. His silence had grown heavier, more deliberate, and though he spoke not a word, the workers closest to the fence avoided his eyes, muttering under their breath that the man unnerved them. One suggested they should wait for an official eviction order, but another scoffed that the board's directive was order enough. And so they continued, dismantling what remained of his shed until the beams lay piled like bones, ready to be carted away. Joanna herself arrived mid-afternoon, striding through the construction dust with the confidence of someone who believed that appearances mattered more than legality. She marched directly to the fence, gestured broadly toward the debris, and declared in a voice loud enough for anyone passing to hear that the reclamation of Lot 14 is proceeding according to community mandate. Her words echoed with rehearsed authority, but even she seemed to falter slightly when she looked at Silas. He did not move, did not acknowledge her presence beyond a slow blink, and the absence of reaction made her speech ring hollow. Still, she turned away before anyone could notice the hesitation, calling for the men to bring in marking paint and survey ropes. That evening, when the machinery quieted and the workers departed, the neighborhood felt strangely tense. The fence glinted in the fading light, encircling Silas's home like a cage, and the half-demolished clubhouse loomed in the background, its broken wall covered with a sheet of plastic that snapped in the wind. Silas remained in his chair long after darkness fell, the glow of his porch light casting a small circle around him. Those few neighbors who dared to glance in his direction later described the sight as eerie. A solitary figure seated in stillness, as if keeping vigil over the ruins of both his property and theirs. The next day, the escalation became more aggressive. A crew returned with clipboards and began affixing violation notices directly to the fencing, accusing Silas of unauthorized occupancy and failure to comply with community standards. The absurdity of charging him with unauthorized occupancy of his own home was not lost on the residents, yet the board's tactics were so relentless, so draped in official language, that even the most skeptical began to doubt themselves. Could it be that Silas had overlooked some clause, some buried rule that allowed the board this authority? The uncertainty spread like a contagion, weakening the resolve of anyone who might have spoken up. Inside his house, Silas remained unmoved. He did not tear down the notices, nor did he attempt to argue against them. Instead, he allowed them to accumulate, sheets of paper fluttering in the wind like white flags, though no one could tell whether they were meant as signs of surrender or warnings yet to be understood. His refusal to respond created a vacuum into which the board poured more rules, more threats, more attempts at control, yet every new act only seemed to deepen the sense that they were fighting against something far larger than one man. As the week wore on, rumors began to circulate that the board had already filed documents to seize the property under eminent domain, though no one had seen such paperwork. Others whispered that Joanna had struck a deal with contractors who stood to profit enormously once Silas's lot was cleared. The truth was murky, but the effect was clear. The community itself was fracturing, half the residents retreating into fearful silence, the other half muttering with resentment at the unchecked power of the board. Through it all, Silas did nothing but sit, watch, and wait, his very inaction turning into a form of resistance stronger than any shouted protest. The breaking point came late on a Friday afternoon when a group of volunteers, emboldened by Joanna's insistence that swift action was required, entered his yard with sledgehammers. They began striking the porch railing, tearing away sections of wood while Silas remained seated only a few feet away. The sound of splintering timber mingled with the dull thud of metal on wood, and though dust and fragments flew, he did not move. One of the men hesitated, sweat dripping into his eyes, and muttered that it felt wrong, that they should wait for proper authority. Another snapped that the board was the authority and continued hammering. It was then that a deep vibration ran through the ground, subtle at first, then growing stronger. The men froze, glancing nervously toward the clubhouse where the patched wall shuddered visibly. A groan of shifting weight rose into the air, followed by the sharp crack of the breaking supports. Panic rippled through the crew. Some dropped their tools and backed away. Others shouted for everyone to get clear. Joanna, standing at the edge of the site, barked that they must stay, that abandoning the task would only worsen their situation. But even she fell silent when another section of the clubhouse roof sagged, sending a cloud of dust billowing outward. In the chaos, Silas remained seated, calm as ever, his eyes fixed on the collapsing structure. For the first time, one of the volunteers looked directly at him and whispered, almost in awe, that the man hadn't lifted a finger, hadn't spoken a word, and yet everything around him was crumbling. Whether it was coincidence or consequence no longer mattered. In their minds, Silas had become something more than an obstinate neighbor. He was the still point at the center of their unraveling, and the more they tried to force him into compliance, the more the ground itself seemed to rebel against them. By nightfall, the porch railing lay in ruins. The clubhouse stood precarious with fresh fractures spiderwebbing across its facade, and the men dispersed with uneasy silence. Joanna vowed that the project would continue, that Moore's resistance would be crushed, but her words no longer carried the same weight. The escalation had begun, and though Silas had not spoken a single sentence, the conflict was no longer about paperwork or property lines. It had become something larger, a battle of will against will, with the entire neighborhood caught in the widening shadow of its consequences. The days after the second collapse carried a strange, suspended quality, as though the entire neighborhood had been caught in a collective breath it was afraid to release. The clubhouse stood wounded, a gaping fracture down one side covered by tarps that ballooned and snapped in the wind, the sound carrying through the cul-de-sacs like an omen. The board responded with a flurry of official-sounding statements delivered by email and printed notices pushed into mailboxes, insisting that the damage was minor, that repairs were underway, and that the project continued with unanimous support. Yet, when residents whispered to each other on driveways or exchanged glances while walking dogs, the tone was no longer casual curiosity, but something closer to dread. The events around Lot 14 had already stretched beyond anything they could rationalize, and the figure of Silas Moore sitting silently on his porch each evening had become the dark center of it all, not through action, but through his refusal to be moved. Joanna Lynn doubled down, her voice at board meetings turning sharper, her gestures more cutting, her demands more reckless. She declared that hesitation was weakness, that the community's credibility depended on proving that no individual could obstruct progress. Her rhetoric blended the language of civic duty with the feverish insistence of someone trying to convince herself. And though many board members sat stiff and pale around the table, none openly opposed her. To do so would be to align with Silas, and no one dared place themselves on that side of the divide. Instead, they voted for further measures: accelerated demolition of unauthorized structures, extended fencing to claim the entire yard, and the deployment of contractors at night to avoid disrupting daytime tranquility. In private, some of them admitted the plan sounded absurd, but the machinery of the board was already in motion, and to halt it now would be to expose their own culpability in everything that had gone wrong. The escalation took on a surreal rhythm. Each evening after dark, trucks rumbled in with new materials, their headlights extinguished before turning onto the street, workers guided only by the glow of handheld lamps. They dismantled Silas's porch in pieces, tore up sections of his yard, and stacked debris against the temporary fencing as if preparing for an evacuation that never came. Neighbors lay awake listening to the grind of saws and the metallic clatter of tools, their unease mounting with every sound. A few even gathered quietly at the end of the block to watch, but none approached. It was as though they feared that crossing too close to Lot 14 would pull them into whatever curse seemed to hang over it. Silas himself behaved with the same quiet persistence that unnerved them all. He never confronted the workers directly, yet he made his presence inescapable. Each morning he would move his chair to a new place in the yard, setting it down deliberately, facing the clubhouse as though measuring the cracks spreading across its walls. He carried no weapon, held no sign, gave no speech. He simply sat, the faint lines of his face unreadable, his stillness amplifying the chaos around him. Some began to believe he was waiting for something, others that he knew something they did not. The workers muttered that his silence made them clumsy, that nails bent in their hands and tools slipped because of the weight of his gaze. Whether true or imagined, the effect was real enough. Accidents multiplied, beams dropped, drills broke, and at least one man left with a fractured wrist after tripping on ground that seemed to shift beneath him. By midweek, the board received a stern letter from the insurance company refusing to cover any further damage if the project continued without a certified inspection. Joanna waved it off with a smile that looked more like a grimace, insisting that inspections only slowed progress and that outside regulators had no jurisdiction here. She reminded the board that they had voted unanimously to pursue reclamation and that backing down now would expose them to lawsuits for negligence of community duty. The word lawsuits silenced the table, for each of them knew their names were already attached to the minutes. Fear of external judgment bound them more tightly to Joanna's reckless course, and so they nodded, each vote cast less from belief than from terror of accountability. The collapse that followed was smaller than before, yet more alarming. Late one night, after hours of hammering on Silas's foundation, a groaning sound rose again from the clubhouse, followed by a sudden plume of dust as a section of flooring caved inward. This time, one of the workers was inside, a man who had been checking measurements. His shout echoed through the night, cut short by the thud of falling timber. They dragged him out with a broken leg and a face ghostly with shock, and though Joanna immediately declared it an unfortunate occupational hazard, the whispers spread quickly. The building was becoming dangerous, the ground beneath it unsteady. Yet, still, they did not stop. The next morning, new lumber arrived and the men returned to shore up the failing structure even as they tore deeper into Silas's property. It was then that the shift occurred. Until this point, Silas's silence had been interpreted as stubbornness or eccentricity, something outside the ordinary but still human. But after the second accident, as the men carried the injured worker past his porch, Silas stood for the first time in days. He rose slowly, deliberately, and watched them file by with the same expressionless calm he had always worn. Yet something in the act of standing unsettled them more than all his sitting had done. One of the volunteers whispered, "He's not leaving, is he?" "He's never leaving." The words spread through the crew like a chill. That night, several men failed to show up for work, claiming illness, and those who remained kept glancing nervously toward the porch where Silas had returned to his chair, unmoving once again. Joanna sensed the shift as well and grew harsher in response. She accused her crew of weakness, accused her board of cowardice, and accused the residents of gossiping like frightened children. At the next meeting, she slammed her fist against the table and demanded that the clubhouse be expanded regardless of obstacles. She called Silas a parasite, a liability, a saboteur, though he had done nothing at all but sit. Her fury only made her seem desperate. But desperation has its own momentum, and once more the board followed her lead, approving funds for even more equipment. The middle of the conflict arrived not with a single event, but with the unmistakable realization that the board could no longer retreat. Their credibility, their pride, and even their sense of identity as leaders of the neighborhood now hinged entirely on breaking Silas. They had already crossed lines of legality, of safety, of morality, and to step back now would be to admit not only failure, but culpability for the wreckage around them. They had bound themselves to the course, and even those who privately doubted Joanna's judgment whispered only in hallways, never in the minutes. Silas remained the same, the silent center of their storm, yet the balance of perception had shifted. What once made him an eccentric outsider now gave him the gravity of inevitability. Neighbors began to speak his name in lowered tones, not in mockery but with an edge of reverence, as if he had become a figure larger than himself, a reminder of the limits of power. His house still stood, battered and fenced but unclaimed, and every new crack in the clubhouse seemed to draw a line connecting their aggression to their undoing. By the end of that week, everyone knew, even if they would not say it aloud, that the battle was no longer about property or community improvement. It had become a test of will, a confrontation between a single unmoving man and an institution that could not admit defeat. And as the middle point of the conflict settled over them like a storm cloud, the question was no longer whether Silas would be removed, but how much more would fall apart before the board admitted that they were destroying themselves in the attempt. By the time the second accident had been quietly written off as another isolated incident, the atmosphere in the neighborhood was brittle, like glass stretched too thin and ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Everyone sensed that the board had gone too far, that the project no longer resembled anything like a legitimate improvement and instead had transformed into a kind of obsessive siege, a campaign against one man whose greatest crime was refusing to move. Yet, rather than retreat, Joanna Lynn and her allies chose to escalate once again, driven by a mixture of pride, fear of humiliation, and the desperate need to prove that their authority remained intact. She began speaking less of community and more of order, invoking words that carried the weight of discipline rather than collaboration, as though the neighborhood were not a place to live but a territory to be subdued. The escalation began with the decision to bring in heavy equipment. Until now, the work had been carried out with hand tools, sledgehammers, and the cautious labor of volunteers. But Joanna declared that progress required machinery, that the sight of bulldozers and excavators would send a clear signal that reclamation was unstoppable. At dawn on a Monday morning, trucks rumbled into the neighborhood, their engines echoing off the houses, their tracks leaving gouges in the manicured streets. Children on their way to school stopped to stare. Dogs barked frantically at the grinding noise of steel, and adults lingered at windows, unable to pretend that this was simply another stage of normal development. The convoy of machines looked less like construction and more like an invading force, and at the center of it all, Silas remained where he always was, seated in his chair near the porch, his gaze fixed on the broken clubhouse that stood increasingly lopsided in the distance. The men operating the equipment were not neighbors but outsiders, contracted through vague agreements that left no paper trail. They were hard-eyed and efficient, men accustomed to demolition jobs in places where consent was never asked. They eyed Silas with mild curiosity but without fear, for they had no stake in the politics of this community. Their orders were simple: remove obstacles, tear down structures, and prepare the ground for annexation. Within hours, the roar of engines filled the air, and the first bite was taken out of the remnants of Silas's shed, the bucket of an excavator reducing beams to splinters with effortless force. Dust rose in choking clouds, coating the fence line in a film of gray, while the vibration rattled windows throughout the street. Neighbors gathered again at a distance, forming small clusters at the corners, their voices low, their eyes darting between the machines and the silent figure on the porch. The tension broke when one of the excavators shifted its weight too close to the unstable ground near the clubhouse. The soil, already weakened by weeks of careless digging and the collapse of underground pipes, gave way with a sickening slump. The massive machine tilted, its bucket crashing into the side of the clubhouse wall, shattering the patched tarp and exposing the interior to daylight. A scream of twisting metal followed as the roof beams bowed under the sudden pressure. Workers scrambled to stabilize the machine while others shouted contradictory orders, their voices carrying panic rather than command. Joanna, standing nearby in her hard hat and reflective vest as though she were the foreman of a legitimate site, shouted that everything was under control, but her voice cracked, betraying the lie. The collapse did not complete itself that day, but the sight of the clubhouse wall sagging, half the roof line visibly slanted, sent a shockwave through the onlookers. Some neighbors turned away in disgust, muttering that this had gone far enough, while others simply stared at Silas as though expecting him to react. But he did not move. He remained still, his face set in that same unreadable calm, and the longer he sat unmoved, the more it seemed that his presence itself was the immovable obstacle against which the entire apparatus of the HOA was breaking. The board could bring machines, they could bring men, they could bring the language of laws twisted into threats, but none of it seemed to change the outcome. Every action taken against him only deepened the cracks in their own structure. That evening, when the workers finally departed and the machines sat silent, the neighborhood was left in a state of hushed disbelief. The clubhouse now looked less like a center of community pride and more like a ruin, a monument to hubris. Joanna held another meeting in the damaged hall, her voice rising in shrill defiance as she insisted that progress was inevitable, that Moore's resistance was a stain on the community's honor, that anyone who doubted the project was complicit in its failure. She pounded her fist against the table, her face red, her eyes sharp, daring anyone to challenge her. But the silence that followed was not agreement. It was exhaustion. The board members avoided her gaze, unwilling to openly oppose her but no longer willing to echo her rhetoric with conviction. In the following days, smaller escalations multiplied. Notices were posted on Silas's fence declaring fines that grew absurdly large, amounts no rational court would recognize, but which the board printed in bold type to give the illusion of authority. Water lines feeding into his property were cut under the guise of maintenance, though neighbors whispered that it was sabotage. At night, new crews attempted to reinforce the failing clubhouse with makeshift supports, but each hammer blow echoed like a warning, and each new brace seemed only to highlight how unstable the structure had become. Silas, meanwhile, remained in his chair, sometimes moving it slightly closer to the fence, sometimes shifting it toward the clubhouse, as though tracking the slow decay. The escalation reached its grim apex when Joanna ordered a full community reclamation day, calling for volunteers to join the hired crews in dismantling what remained of Silas's property. Flyers appeared in mailboxes with patriotic slogans, framing the event as a collective effort to preserve the future. Few showed up willingly, but enough felt pressured to attend that. By noon, the yard swarmed with bodies, some swinging hammers, others hauling debris, all moving with the unease of people who knew they were participating in something they would later regret. It was during this frenzy that the final crack echoed through the clubhouse, a sound like a tree splitting in a storm. The ground trembled, dust poured out in sheets, and the central beam of the roof gave way, dropping half the structure into a heap of rubble. Screams erupted, people scattered, and through the chaos, Silas stood for the second time, his chair left empty on the porch. He stepped to the fence, gripped the chain link lightly with one hand, and watched as the symbol of the board's authority collapsed in a plume of dust and broken timber. No one spoke to him. No one dared. The volunteers fled, the contractors muttered curses, and Joanna stood frozen, her face pale, her clipboard dangling uselessly at her side. The escalation had achieved nothing but destruction, and in that moment the reality became undeniable. The attempt to break one silent man had instead broken the very institution that sought to crush him. And still, he had not uttered a single word. The ruin of the clubhouse should have been the end, a natural conclusion to weeks of reckless decisions and blind persistence. But Joanna Lynn refused to surrender, even as the dust still hung in the air and the fractured beams jutted skyward like bones of some great carcass. Her voice, once sharp with certainty, now carried the ragged edge of desperation as she barked orders no one wanted to follow, demanding that the rubble be cleared immediately, that the project continue without delay, that Silas Moore be removed at all costs. Yet the volunteers had vanished, the contractors were gone, and even the most loyal board members avoided her eyes, muttering excuses about personal obligations, drifting away from the scene of their collective undoing. What remained was silence, broken only by the creak of the broken clubhouse shifting under its own unstable weight and the quiet rasp of wind dragging across the collapsed roof. Silas did not celebrate, and he did not smile. When he stepped away from the fence and returned to his chair, his movements carried the same measured calm they always had. But to those who watched from behind their curtains, that calm seemed to radiate authority stronger than any title or bylaw. He was no longer the eccentric recluse on Lot 14. He had become the immovable point against which the entire machinery of the HOA had broken itself. Neighbors whispered that he had done nothing, and yet he had done everything, that his silence had turned their noise back upon them until it consumed their own creation. In their minds, the man who never raised his voice had defeated an institution that demanded obedience through endless words. But Joanna could not allow such an interpretation to stand. At the emergency meeting she convened in the wreckage of the clubhouse, chairs dragged into a half-standing room lit by portable lamps, she thundered that Moore had sabotaged them, that his refusal to comply had endangered lives, that his presence was not resistance but aggression. She demanded that the board file charges, hire lawyers, and summon police to force him out. Yet her words, so often met with nods and dutiful signatures, now fell into the heavy air without response. The others sat stiffly, their eyes darting between the splintered beams above and the woman whose insistence had led them here, and though none dared to openly rebuke her, none would bind themselves further to her crusade. She slammed her clipboard down, the crack echoing like a gunshot, but still the silence endured. The culmination came not with a formal decree, but with the collapse of Joanna's authority in real time. One by one, members of the board slipped away, muttering half-formed excuses, unwilling to sit any longer beneath the broken roof that symbolized their failure. By the time she turned to demand their loyalty again, half the chairs were empty, and those who remained stared at the floor, their pens motionless. She was left alone with her fury, her voice rising higher as if volume could restore what power had drained from her. Outside, the neighbors had gathered in cautious knots, not cheering, not chanting, but simply standing in witness as the last fragments of the clubhouse groaned and toppled. And through it all, Silas Moore remained seated at his porch, steady as stone, his silence louder than any accusation. The clubhouse that had been meant as the monument to the board's power now lay in ruins, and the woman who had driven the community into madness stood isolated, her authority crumbling faster than the walls behind her. No legal notice, no chain-link fence, no heavy machinery could alter the fact that she had destroyed her own house of power in the attempt to seize his. For the first time in weeks, Silas rose to his feet, not to speak, not to argue, but to simply step to the edge of his porch and look directly at the wreckage. That single gesture was enough to complete the story in the minds of everyone who watched. He had outlasted them, not with force, not with pleading, but with endurance, and in the end the board had defeated itself. The dust settled, the echoes faded, and the truth could no longer be denied. The battle for Lot 14 had reached its breaking point, and it was not the man who had been broken. In the weeks that followed the collapse, the neighborhood seemed to move with the tentative caution of a body recovering from shock. The rubble of the clubhouse was fenced off, not with the aggressive banners of expansion but with the neutral boards of safety warnings, and no crews returned to clear it away. Insurance companies refused to pay, the contractors demanded fees that the board could no longer cover, and the municipality, long content to let the HOA manage its own affairs, opened an inquiry after receiving a flood of anonymous complaints. Joanna Lynn vanished almost overnight, her house dark, her car gone, her name no longer attached to any message or notice. Some said she fled to avoid litigation. Others whispered she had been forced out by those within the board who sought to preserve themselves. But in truth, her absence mattered less than the vacuum it created. For the first time in years, the HOA met without a clear leader, and what remained of the board splintered quickly. Some resigned in shame, unwilling to carry the weight of failure. Others attempted to salvage legitimacy by proposing smaller projects, painting the fiasco as a misunderstanding. Yet their words carried no force. Attendance at meetings dwindled. Fees went unpaid, and the intricate web of control that had once bound the residents unraveled thread by thread. The authority that had once dictated the color of mailboxes and the height of hedges dissolved into silence, leaving the community adrift, but freer than it had been in decades. Silas Moore remained unchanged. His house, battered but intact, stood as it always had, and each evening he still took his chair to the porch, gazing outward with the same calm that had unsettled so many. Yet now, when neighbors passed, they no longer averted their eyes. Some nodded respectfully. Others offered quiet greetings. A few even paused to thank him without quite knowing why. He never replied, but his silence no longer felt like defiance. It felt like presence, a reminder that endurance itself could be a form of victory. Over time, the ruined clubhouse became a kind of monument, not celebrated but accepted, a scar left to remind them all of what pride and coercion had wrought. Children played near it. Adults used its shadow as a landmark, and eventually the talk of rebuilding faded, replaced by an unspoken understanding that some things were better left in ruins. Silas never claimed triumph, never sought credit, never raised his voice to declare anything at all. Yet everyone knew that he had outlasted an institution that once seemed untouchable. The HOA was not reformed so much as dissolved, its rules lingering only in memory, its officers scattered. What remained was a neighborhood without rulers, forced to find its own balance. And at its quiet center, on Lot 14, sat the man who had proven, without lifting a hand or uttering a word, that some battles can be won simply by refusing to move.